So this year I decided to put my Sony FX30 to the test by shooting it under low light conditions. I did this by shooting some fireworks during the 4th of July and not using any external lighting. The only lighting that I ended up using was the lighting from the night sky and then some street lamps, and then also the lighting that was coming from the fireworks as well. The purpose of this video is for me to run through a couple of the settings that I used in order to achieve these low light condition shots that I showed at the beginning of this video, but also to help you guys understand the proper settings that you guys need to be using within your camera body, whether you're using a Sony FX30 or any camera that you may own. One of the main things that I have heard is that the Sony FX30 is very bad when it comes to low light conditions, and you get a ton of noise whenever you're trying to shoot under dimly lit scenarios. I don't believe that that's true. Although you may get some noise, you are fully capable of eliminating that by knowing the proper equipment and the proper settings to use. And no, I'm not talking about post noise reduction software. All the video clips that I showed at the beginning of this video were straight out of the camera without any post noise reduction software added to them. First things that I wanted to note is I ended up using a Sony Sniper autofocus f1.2 aperture lens. I have the 16mm currently set on my camera, but I also have the 56mm version here in my hands. With an f1.2 aperture, that is referring to the amount of light that is going to be allowed into your camera sensor by the opening of the lens. The lower the number, such as f1.2, the better, because that allows for a wider opening, allowing the maximum amount of light to your camera sensor, which is super important when shooting with a crop sensor or Super 35 camera sensor, and then just with any camera sensor in general. So that's going to be the first thing that you want to take into consideration when trying to shoot low light conditions, is having a fast aperture or a super wide opening within your camera lens. The second thing that I wanted to take some time to talk about was the dual base ISO within the Sony FX30. This is important for you to know, especially when you're trying to shoot in low light conditions, because a base ISO or a dual base ISO within the FX30 or any camera in general is going to be the ISO setting that introduces the least amount of noise to your video footage. With the Sony FX30, the dual base ISO is 800 and 2500. So because I was shooting in low light conditions, I upped it to the 2500 base ISO, which gives more artificial lighting to the sensor in combination with a fast aperture lens such as the f1.2 Sony Sniper. This will maximize the amount of light being entered and displayed in your camera sensor. ISO is artificial lighting that is not introducing additional lighting to your camera, but it helps with the exposure of your scene by introducing artificial lighting into your camera sensor with the least amount of noise being introduced to your video. So super important for you to know both aperture and base ISOs within your camera. The other thing that I wanted to note is that I shot in 2 different frame rates when it came to that nighttime footage. I shot in 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second. I wanted to take some extra time to talk about the frame rates because this makes a big difference, especially in low light scenarios, because depending on what frame rate you're going to be using is how much light you are allowing to be introduced per frame into your camera sensor. In order for that to make sense, I want to touch base on 60 frames per second and 24 frames per second comparison. 60 frames per second means that you're capturing 60 frames per second with your camera sensor. You are capturing 60 frames really quickly. Each frame does not get as much time to allow light to hit the sensor for that specific frame. In comparison to 24 frames per second, you are allowing more time per frame to capture the maximum amount of light when being recorded with your camera. That's the main difference when it comes to those two. The other thing is that with 60 frames per second and the Sony FX30, that is going to allow you to get some slow motion footage, which I showed at the beginning of this video. 24 frames per second gives you a little bit more natural look in regards to the motion that's being captured with your video. All the other settings within my camera were completely the same. The only difference between the 60 frames per second and 24 frames per second footage was that, just the frame rate within my camera. By the time that I had started shooting the video for the 4th of July, it had already been past 9 p.m. So not much light was available for me to use, which is why it was super important for me to know the proper settings to set my camera in. In addition to that, you want to be able to capture the most amount of information within your highlights and your shadows. That's the main reason why I shoot an S-Log 3 using my Sony FX30. But even without that, you want to try to overexpose your footage. That way you're able to retain as much information as possible, but then in post you can bring that exposure down and then make it look natural while also reducing the amount of noise that you may capture in your shadows. In today's day and age, it's super simple for you to get rid of noise using post-production software. I edit and color grade all my videos in DaVinci Resolve, and DaVinci Resolve has a noise reduction plugin that allows you to reduce the amount of noise in your already noisy footage. None of the footage that I showed in the 4th of July video and none of the footage that I showed at the beginning of this video have post noise reduction software added to them. I wanted to test the limits of the Sony FX30 by allowing the settings within the camera to function how they're supposed to, whatever settings I needed to set, and then trying to correct it in post. That's going to be one main thing that you want to focus on with footage in general. You want to try to get your footage as close to the final production as possible, or the most ideal footage for your post-production process. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you.